Story 1: The Whispering Pines. The wind in the pines was the first thing they noticed. It wasn't the usual rustle of branches or the gentle sigh of a breeze through the trees. No, this was different. It was a whisper, low, insistent, and just barely audible, as if the forest itself were trying to tell them something. The group of hikers, 6 in total, had been drawn to the remote stretch of wilderness known as the Whispering Pines by its reputation. It was a place few dared to venture, a place where the trees grew so close together that the sunlight barely touched the ground, and the air always carried a chill, even in the height of summer. The locals had warned them, of course. They always did. Tales of hikers who had gone missing, of strange lights in the sky, of voices that called out in the night. But the group had laughed it off. They were experienced, seasoned adventurers who had faced down blizzards, avalanches, and worse. A few ghost stories weren't going to scare them off. They set up camp in a small clearing, the tents arranged in a tight circle around a crackling fire. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the faint tang of wood smoke. The group joked and laughed, their voices carrying through the trees, but there was an edge to their laughter now, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. The whispers were growing louder. "You hear that?" asked Mark, the group's de facto leader. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a beard that made him look older than his 32 years. He tilted his head, listening. "Hear what?" replied Sarah, his girlfriend. She was sitting cross-legged by the fire, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. "The wind," Mark said. "It sounds like voices." The others fell silent, listening. The whispers were faint, but unmistakable now. They seemed to come from all around, weaving through the trees like a song. "It's just the wind," said Tom, the youngest of the group at 25. He was trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were words, phrases, fragments of sentences that seemed to echo the hikers' deepest fears and secrets. "You'll never make it out of here," one voice hissed. "They're watching you," another murmured. "You're going to die alone," a third whispered. The group tried to ignore the voices, to convince themselves it was just their imaginations playing tricks on them. But it was hard to ignore the way the whispers seemed to follow them, to cling to them like a second skin. By midnight, the tension in the camp was palpable. The fire had burned down to embers, and the shadows seemed to press in closer, darker. The whispers were constant now, a low, insidious hum that filled the air. "I can't take this anymore," Sarah said suddenly, standing up. "I'm going to bed." The others murmured their agreement, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. They retreated to their tents, zipping themselves in against the cold and the whispers. But sleep didn't come easily. The whispers followed them into their tents, slipping through the fabric like smoke. They were louder now, more insistent, and they seemed to be coming from inside the tents themselves. Mark lay awake, staring up at the roof of his tent. The whispers were a constant drone in his ears, but there was one voice that stood out, clear and sharp. "You're not who they think you are," it said. "They'll find out. They'll leave you." He clenched his fists, trying to block out the voice, but it was no use. It was inside his head, burrowing deep, rooting out his darkest fears. The next morning, the group was quiet, subdued. No one mentioned the whispers, but they were all thinking about them. They packed up their gear in silence, the only sound the crunch of snow under their boots. The day passed in a blur of hiking and uneasy silence. The whispers were still there, but they were fainter now, easier to ignore. The group tried to convince themselves that it had just been a trick of the wind, a product of their exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the forest. But that night, the whispers returned, louder and more menacing than before. "You're not alone," one voice hissed. "They're coming for you," another whispered. "You'll never escape." The group huddled around the fire, their faces pale and drawn. No one wanted to admit it, but they were all scared. "We should leave," Sarah said suddenly. "First thing in the morning. This place. It's not right." The others nodded their agreement, but Mark shook his head. "We can't," he said. "We've come too far. We'll stick it out one more night." The others didn't argue. They knew Mark well enough to know that once he made up his mind, there was no changing it. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around, closing in on the camp. And then, one by one, the hikers began to disappear. It started with Tom. He had gone to his tent to fetch a jacket, and when he didn't come back, the others went to check on him. His tent was empty, the zipper still closed from the inside. There were no footprints in the snow leading away from the tent, no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished. The group searched the area, calling his name, but there was no response. The whispers seemed to grow louder with every passing minute, taunting them, mocking them. By morning, 2 more hikers were gone. Sarah and Alex, a quiet, reserved man who had been with the group for years. Their tents were empty, just like Tom's, with no sign of where they had gone. Mark and the remaining 2 hikers, Jess and Ryan, were frantic. They packed up their gear as quickly as they could, desperate to get out of the forest. But as they hiked, the whispers followed them, growing louder and more menacing with every step. "You'll never make it out," the voices hissed. "They're coming for you. You're next." By nightfall, Jess was gone. They had stopped to make camp, and when Mark and Ryan turned around, she was simply gone. Her backpack was still there, her tent half set up, but there was no sign of her. Mark and Ryan didn't sleep that night. They sat by the fire, their eyes darting nervously into the shadows, their ears straining against the whispers. "We have to keep moving," Ryan said finally, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." Mark nodded, but he knew it was no use. The forest was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. They packed up their gear and set off into the darkness, the whispers growing louder with every step. The trees seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening, the air growing colder. And then Ryan was gone. One moment he was there, walking beside Mark, and the next he was gone. Mark was alone now, the whispers a constant, deafening roar in his ears. He stumbled through the forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw it, a small leather-bound journal lying in the snow. He picked it up with trembling hands, his heart sinking as he recognized the handwriting on the cover. It was his own. He opened the journal, his eyes scanning the pages. The entries were written in his handwriting, but they detailed events that hadn't happened yet, events that were happening now. The last entry was dated tomorrow. It read, "I won't be the last." Mark's hands trembled as he closed the journal, his mind racing. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to make it out of the forest alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, closing in around him. He could feel them now, cold and sharp against his skin, pulling at him, dragging him deeper into the forest. And then he was gone. The forest was silent once more, the whispers fading into the wind. The journal lay in the snow, its pages fluttering in the breeze. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the whispering pines, the trees began to whisper again. They were waiting for the next group. Story 2: The Fire That Doesn't Burn. The first thing the ranger noticed was the silence. The kind that doesn't just sit heavy on the forest but presses down like a held breath, like something unseen is listening. The morning sun filtered through the trees, weak and washed out, but the clearing ahead was darker, like twilight had settled just in that one spot. He found the tent standing perfectly intact, no sign of disturbance except for the fact that no one was inside. The fire pit was cold, the ground untouched by ash. But a few feet away, at the base of a charred tree, lay a heap of fine, white dust, the only trace of someone who had once been human. And carved into the bark of a nearby tree, the words stood out like a warning. "It doesn't burn, it consumes." The cold fire. Danny and Beth had planned the camping trip for weeks. A chance to get away, escape the noise of the city, maybe mend things between them. Beth had been distant lately, her smiles thinner, her touch lighter. And Danny, well, he had his own ghosts, but he kept them buried beneath jokes and campfire whiskey. The forest was in the grip of a long drought, and the trees looked brittle, like they could snap with a breath of wind. The fire warnings had been extreme: no open flames, no campfires. Not that it mattered. When they set up camp, the air was thick with an eerie stillness, like the woods themselves were waiting for something. That was when they first saw it. A flickering light just beyond the trees. Beth pointed. "Is that a fire?" Danny squinted. No smoke, but it danced, shifting like an open flame, except it was wrong. The color of it wasn't orange or red, but pale like the ghost of a fire, a thing that should have been hot but felt like ice water down the spine. It didn't spread. It didn't touch the trees. It just hovered, swaying like something watching them. "We should go," Beth whispered. Danny nodded. They turned back toward their tent, and as they did, the fire followed. Something watching. That night, Danny lay awake, listening. The woods were too quiet. Even in the dead of night, a forest should be alive. Crickets, owls, the rustle of unseen things. But now there was only absence. A vacuum. Then he noticed the glow, faint through the thin fabric of the tent. Beth was beside him, breathing slow and steady. He turned his head toward the entrance, and his blood turned to ice. The fire was inside the tent, not burning, not consuming the fabric or the ground beneath it, just existing. It flickered and shifted, casting no heat, no smoke, no scent of charred earth. But it was moving, creeping toward Beth. Danny reached for her, shaking her shoulder. "Beth, wake up." Nothing. She was cold, too cold. Then she was gone. The sleeping bag lay empty, her shape still imprinted in the fabric. But Beth was nothing more than a whisper of warmth fading into the air. And in her place, the fire pulsed, stretching toward him. Danny scrambled out of the tent, stumbling backward, heart pounding. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around. No sign of Beth, just the heap of ashes in the place where she had been. The fire within. Danny ran. Branches tore at his arms, his legs. He could hear his own heartbeat, feel the raw scrape of air in his throat. But no matter how far he went, the glow was there. Not ahead of him, not behind him, but inside him. His hands trembled as he lifted them to his face. Beneath the skin, something flickered. Tiny veins of light, creeping like embers beneath a sheet of paper. It didn't burn. It didn't even hurt. But he could feel it, spreading. He stumbled, falling hard against a tree. His breath hitched, and for a moment he could swear he heard something whispering. Not words, not exactly, but a presence, a knowing. He clutched his chest, gasping, fingers digging into the flesh, as if he could rip it out. But the glow only pulsed, steady, calm, inevitable. It had chosen him. The last words. By the time the ranger arrived the next morning, the clearing was still. The tent stood untouched. No sign of struggle, no footprints leading away. Just the pile of ashes, finer than any natural fire could leave. Too perfect, too precise. And the words carved into the tree, fresh as if they had just been etched. It doesn't burn, it consumes. Epilogue, the next fire. 2 weeks later, a new fire report came in. A wildfire that wasn't a wildfire. A blaze that did not consume, did not burn, only left behind empty homes, untouched furniture, and something worse than bodies. Nothing at all. And in the center of the devastation, scrawled into the blackened remains of a wooden beam, a final warning. It doesn't burn, it spreads. Story 3: The Shadow in the RV. The first time Emily saw the shadow, she thought it was a trick of the trees. Just a long, black smear against the thick pines surrounding their campsite. But when it moved, really moved, against the grain of the wind, her breath caught in her throat. It was watching her. She was sure of it. And it was getting closer. The Richards family had been looking forward to this trip for months. A full-blown, cross-country adventure in a rented RV, packed with fishing poles, board games, and enough snacks to last them a lifetime. Tom and Lisa Richards, both in their early 40s, saw it as a last hurrah before their teenage daughter, Emily, went off to college. Their younger son, Jake, was just excited to sleep in the little bunk above the driver's seat. Their first few nights were uneventful, roasting marshmallows, hiking scenic trails, and playing endless rounds of Uno. But on the third night, camped beside a quiet lake in Montana, Emily saw it. The shadow. It stood at the tree line, tall and unmoving, its edges blurred like smoke against the moonlit woods. At first, she told herself it was a tree, or maybe another camper, though she saw no flash of a flashlight, no telltale rustling of movement. Then, just as she was about to turn away, it stepped forward. Not walked, stepped, like it had been waiting for her to see it. Emily gasped and spun toward her parents, who sat by the fire, laughing at one of Jake's ridiculous stories. When she turned back, the shadow was gone. She didn't sleep that night. By the time they reached Wyoming, strange things had begun happening. Small at first, little noises, like someone tapping on the RV's thin walls. Items went missing only to reappear in odd places. Emily's phone charger ended up in the fridge. Lisa's wedding ring was found buried in a bag of marshmallows. Jake swore he heard whispering while he lay in his bunk, just before sleep took him. Then came the footsteps. They started one night while the family lay in their beds, the fire outside reduced to smoldering embers. A slow, deliberate creaking on the roof, like someone was walking along the length of the RV. Tom, always the skeptic, grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, circling the vehicle. Nothing, but when he climbed back into bed, the footsteps resumed. Emily barely slept anymore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure standing outside her window, closer than before. Each night, it was a little nearer, its shape sharper, more defined. One night, she snapped a picture of the trees just before locking up for bed. In the morning, she looked at it. The shadow was there, peering from behind a tree. She showed her parents, but they dismissed it as paranoia. Until the night the RV moved on its own. They had parked at a designated campsite near the Grand Canyon, with a few other campers nearby. That night, Emily swore she heard voices, thin, whispering, just outside the RV. She lay frozen in her bed, listening as something scraped against the walls. Then, blackness. When she woke up, her body was stiff, heavy, like something had pressed down on her chest all night. The RV's interior was eerily quiet. The first thing she noticed was the light, blinding sunlight pouring through the windows. Her stomach turned. It was too bright, too open. Emily shot up and ran to the front of the RV, where Tom and Lisa were already standing, their faces pale. They were no longer at the campsite. Instead, the RV sat in the middle of an empty field, miles from where they had parked. The road was gone. No other campers, no trees, no trail leading back to civilization. Just an endless stretch of dead grass. Lisa grabbed her phone. No signal. Then Jake let out a small, strangled noise. "Mom!" He was pointing to the bathroom mirror. Scrawled across the glass in smeared, dark letters were 4 words. "You brought me with you." Panic set in. Tom insisted someone had moved them in the night. A cruel prank, maybe. But who? And how? Emily checked her phone again. Her heart nearly stopped. The pictures she had taken of their trip, the smiling faces, the campfires, the scenic views had changed. The shadow was in every single one of them. First, it was small, tucked away in the background, nearly indistinguishable from a trick of the light. But with each passing photo, it drew closer. Behind trees, peeking from behind a picnic table, standing at the edge of the RV's door. The last picture Emily had taken just the night before was the worst. The family sat by the fire roasting marshmallows. But behind them, right in the center of the frame, stood the shadow, looming, towering over them, faceless and watching. Right behind them. Emily dropped the phone with a gasp. Tom didn't waste another second. He got behind the wheel and floored it, tearing across the field until they found a road. They drove for hours, not stopping until they reached a crowded RV park in Arizona. That night, Lisa refused to sleep inside. They set up outside, under the safety of the lights, surrounded by other campers. And still, Emily felt it watching. They cut the trip short, returned the RV without explanation, drove home in silence. For a while, Things seemed normal again. No whispers, no footsteps, no shadows lurking in photographs. Then, a week later, Lisa went to grab something from the bathroom. A scream tore through the house. Tom and Emily rushed in to find her staring at the mirror. There, written in that same smeared script, were the words, "I'm still with you." And from the corner of her eye, Emily saw movement in the reflection. A shadow, standing just behind her.